I sound and possibly even look like most of the people who so boldly entered our nation's capital while the Electoral College certification was being done. And I'm probably closer on the political spectrum to most of them than most anyone in the room who was worried about coming face to face with them. However, the first question that occurred to me watching these events is simply, are the Capitol Police allowed to defend the Capitol or not? Everyone was seemingly outraged by the death of the one lady because she was unarmed. I saw that shooting from at least one angle, and it looked to me like she was climbing through one of the last barricades before she would have come face to face with some politicians, so I don't really understand what else you could have expected from that situation. I know we live in a world where we expect American police to be black belts in jiu-jitsu and be able to subdue people without shooting them, but that certainly isn't our culture, and in this case, you have no way of knowing who is armed and who is not. Again, this is America. So, assuming everybody's armed, especially when they're trying to get at politicians, is probably a decent bet. But yeah, as far as I understand it, the very steps leading up to those buildings are off limit to the public. In other words, if you are not supposed to be there and you are there, you are trespassing. Free speech, the Constitution does not protect trespassing. So that's out the window. This clearly is a criminal event from the get-go, even before they broke in, right? But concerning this idea that this was a coup attempt, again, we have to refer back to which nation this occurred in. Any coup attempt where people are invading D.C. and trying to change the outcome of the government with force is going to involve guns. The fact that apparently all of these people were unarmed shows that they had no intention of a formal coup of any kind. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't trying to intimidate. Obviously, they were. So the question then becomes, are you allowed to, quote-unquote, intimidate a politician, if by that you mean come face-to-face with them, be in an uncomfortable physical proximity with them, and possibly hurt their feelings with your words? The American historical answer to that is yes, you are. And in fact, it's led to several of our presidents being shot. JFK being the exception, of course, because he was in the motorcade. But yes, it is our tradition that you can get in the face of a representative of yours who you feel is not representing you properly. And in fact, that was done, as far as I know, legally, both to Mitt Romney on his way to those proceedings and Lindsey Graham on his way after in the airports. But to come back around to this coup word that's being used so lightly, considering that the vast majority of these trespassers were unarmed. You have to know that among the MAGA and Q crowd, there are many military veterans. And unfortunately, what we learned from this event is that if a paramilitary force of any kind, let's say a dozen guys, maybe even less, had actually tried to perform a coup or an attack on the line of secession, they probably would have succeeded. The fact that a whole bunch of unarmed people got that far and the National Guard did not respond, which of course might have been Trump's fault, but the fact that a group of unarmed people came that close shows that a trained team with rifles and suicide vests would have gone in there and made it look like the ending of Inglourious Bastards. So I think the main consequence of this is going to be that Washington, D.C. will be like a fortress from now on. And some would probably say that it should have been like that all along. Certainly there have been many movies. I think the main one is called Olympus Has Fallen, exploring the idea of a paramilitary attack on the government in Washington, D.C. So it's a little bit surprising that it wasn't already that way. But part of the reason it wasn't that way is, again, refer back to there is an American tradition that because we are a democratic republic and we supposedly elect politicians whose job it is to represent the will of the people, there is this idea that the people ought to have the right to look those politicians in the eye and be heard, even if it's screaming at them through a bullhorn. Well, the days of that are done because of this. Mike Cernovich said that this is the left wing's 9/11, and what he meant by that is 9/11 leading to the passing of the Patriot Act and allowing the RNC to go wreak all of the havoc in the Middle Eastern sandbox that it possibly could have wanted. In that context, I think it is an apt comparison because the left is absolutely going to use this as an opportunity to turn D.C. into a fortress, if not its own state, and get those, I think 2 more senators probably. And of course, they're already summoning their big tech friends to pretty much commit the info purge. It started with Alex Jones, and of course, I wasn't an info warrior, so I didn't speak up to echo the old poem. But now we've moved on to General Flynn, and of course, Trump himself being unceremoniously booted off the social media platforms because they committed wrongthink. And they are certainly the first, but not the last. So even though this was a very foolish move on the part of the rioters, disastrous strategically or politically, when we consider the fact that it doesn't seem like a whole lot of thought really went into it to begin with, I think it is interesting to step back and question what was the intent, because the intent clearly was not to successfully assassinate anyone or anything like that. The answer that comes to my mind is these people, the MAGA and Q people, who were so certain that the election has been unfairly stolen, unfairly given to Joe Biden. They lack cynicism. That's their problem. That is the reason why they saw fit to do such a foolish thing. What do I mean? They chose to, shall we say, aggressively avail themselves of that right to yell and scream and practically intimidate their representatives because they're supposed to be their representatives, similar to how a drill sergeant is allowed to yell at the soldiers under his command. But what they don't understand is that even though you're allowed to perhaps be in those people's presence, you are not the one calling the shots. It's been that way for quite a while, but now it's going to be made abundantly clear that the politicians are and have been so disconnected from the plebs that any peaceful display or any attempt to sway their opinion by way of saying, well, we the people want this or that, is so much dust in the wind. All these little attempts at aggressive persuasion do is breed even more resentment. The hard truth of it is, even though all of these politicians have the name of a state next to their name, they do not represent the people of that state. And deep down, I think we all know that the idea of trying to represent 300 million people doesn't even make sense in a vacuum, much less in the real world. This is why we originally tried the Articles of Confederation first, because Back then, as R.L. Dabney says in Stonewall Jackson's biography, when you used the word state in the United States, it had the same ring to it as saying the state of France. That's the level of independence and sovereignty that the states had under the Articles of Confederation. And the whole idea was that just because every couple of years you get to elect a new quote-unquote representative and send them off to Washington does not guarantee that they're always going to do the will of their constituents. And so they wanted you to have the option to very easily take your pick and move to a different state if you don't like the direction that yours is going in. But with the Civil War, the 10th Amendment principle of treating the states as though they are separate powers that just so happen to be united because they feel better off that way has obviously been thrown out the window. It's still there on paper, but it's never enforced. So what that means is that those very fears that prompted the Articles of Confederation, rather than the system that we have post-Civil War, have absolutely come true. All of the states get to send their alleged representative, but at the end of the day, D.C. has its own culture. D.C. is not a 50-way pie wherein each of the states vies for its own culture and the preferences of its own people. D.C. is a dictatorial power unto itself that controls, oversees, is the bureaucracy over the states. If one is conscious of that, then one knows that a stunt like this would have absolutely zero positive ramifications. But again, it clearly wasn't very well thought out. Probably what prompted this more than anything is the stress of 2020. But of course, that's not entirely sufficient to explain it, because this was noticeably a one-race riot. So let's talk about that for just a second. What prompted these working and middle-class white Americans to do this, other than, say, what CNN and MSNBC are going to tell you, which is that they were stirred into a frenzy by QAnon conspiracy theories, which maybe they were, but I think the history books will probably connect this back to the Tea Party phenomenon that occurred under Obama, and that was sort of the right-wing whites having their own version of Occupy Wall Street, which of course was more for the left-wing whites. And the gist of the Tea Party, even though I'm sure this isn't how they described themselves on paper, was to basically say, hey, this American dream said that if I was working or middle class and white or something on that spectrum, my kids would have a better life than I did, would have a brighter future than I did. And it looks like, due to all this outsourcing, automation, and they took our jobs type stuff, that is not true anymore. So the Tea Party was a fairly, now in retrospect, quaint and civil way of voicing discontent about the fact that white America feels its expectations are not being met, and that in some ways it's not getting what it deserves or what it's accustomed to. And it seems that the successfulness of candidate Trump was to lean into those people where the Republican establishment abhorred them. Because, of course, the Republican establishment are, yes, technically on the right wing, but solidly the upper-class whites. So they want nothing to do with the Tea Party types. They view them as trailer trash, so to speak. and so Trump catered, one might even say pandered, to Tea Party types and did what few American politicians have thought to do, which is to risk offending their friends in their own economic class in order to get the votes of all those in lower classes. This may be Trump's most unforgivable infraction or taboo that he committed against the status quo, because clearly, being the billionaire New York skyscraper builder, he was rubbing shoulders with people like the Clintons and most of the Hollywood known names, etc. And he decided that he did not like those friends well enough to let them forestall his chances at becoming president. And apparently this is something completely unforgivable based on the way in which he has triggered them forevermore, and is probably either going to have to pardon himself and everyone he knows here in the last few days, or be content to live on a super yacht in international waters from now on. So the interesting question now becomes, what happens to the GOP post-Trump? Because all of them, like the rats they are, clearly trying to get off of the ship when the waters got choppy. But I have a hunch that most of the political power, the oomph to actually get things done that is left in the Republican Party, is centered upon the working and middle-class whites that comprise the majority of the U.S., both in population and geography, landmass. And needless to say, those types that went from being Tea Party to MAGA to Q do not appreciate traitors. In fact, that is the word that is being screamed at Mitt Romney, Lindsey Graham, etc. So the issue becomes, who is going to vote for these milquetoast Democrat lights? In other words, what message is the RNC selling, if not Trumpism? After George W. and under Obama, they at least had a bit of a foil where they could say, well, we're not for Obama, he's a socialist, because he's trying to give everybody slightly better health care than they had beforehand. But now they're in a bit of a pickle, because Joe Biden is a consummate establishment politician. He does not rock the boat, at least not unless he's in such a position of power that it doesn't matter whether he rocks the boat or not, which maybe the Democrats will achieve during this 4 years. We'll have to wait and see. But the point being, it's going to be very difficult for the likes of Mitch McConnell to paint Biden as some kind of radical against which they are the last defense. Biden next to them does not look any different than them, and so the only real difference seems to be that Biden is willing to give some credence to what people like AOC and Bernie Sanders say, which is all stuff that has its own populist bent, albeit on the other side of the political spectrum. What I mean by that, well, I'm referring in particular to this idea of the next wave of corona recovery stimulus checks, the $2,000. Mitch McConnell waltzed out there and he said, well, we don't want to subsidize Democrats and their rich friends. And that was it. That was all he said as an excuse for not offering the American people, right before the most important Senate runoff that we've had in memory, some free money. So effectively what he did is he said, I'm not going to give you free money, but I will gladly let my political enemies offer it to you instead. So it's I texted someone after I saw that reply, Mitch, do you even Machiavelli, bro? I'd have a whole lot more respect for it if I thought that the reason why he refused to the free money opportunity is because of some principle. But obviously this is where the RNC begins to look like controlled opposition for the one-party government that we have in D.C. is because both parties are tickled pink for the Federal Reserve to be the true deep state or shadow government running things behind and above all of them. In other words, each party is perfectly content for us to print the dollar until it's worthless, just so long as we can keep milking this puppy like the banana republic that it is. So long as their stock portfolios, again, remember, politicians, for the most part in the U.S. right now, are upper-class whites. That's the definition. Saying that any of them are sincerely left-wing or right-wing is a real stretch. I mean, maybe you can say that some of the minorities, like AOC and Ilhan Omar of the Squad, have some actual political convictions, but I kind of doubt that too. So all this really is because they are not there to represent the filthy plebs, the deplorables. That's what they think of average Americans. They are there to do what any sort of imperial government is about, which is to hurt enemies and reward friends. And in particular, as far as enriching themselves, it's just about keeping the stock market at record highs every year. Obviously, that's unsustainable by any economic metric. It's the mother of all bubbles. Well, it's a cluster of bubbles. But it will keep happening so long as we do not take Ron Paul's advice and do not audit the Fed or do not look too closely at how the creature from Jekyll Island operates. And that is why both the RNC and the DNC seem entirely unbothered by the prospect of all small businesses in the U.S. being ruined. Because those are not publicly traded companies, so who cares? Clearly, the GOP are not conservatives in an ideological or principled sense, because none of them have any problem with central banking or the military-industrial complex, etc. And then they can't even play Trump's game and pretend to be loyal to the strong man, which is kind of the best way of being faux right-wing without it being obvious to the classes that you're pandering to. Now that they've failed both of those tests, their last choice was to be a sort of foil for radical Democrats and at the same time do a little bit of courting of undecideds and moderates who mostly would have voted for independents or libertarians. But with the denial of the stimulus checks, clearly they're not doing that. They're happy for the Democrats to be the party that monopolizes the idea of paying you to vote, pretty much. Let's be honest. We're all adults here. And so now Tammany Hall is the entire country, and only one party is willing to avail itself of those machinations. Again, I don't believe for a minute that the GOP refuses to avail itself out of principle. It's just the fact that things are going well, and frankly, it's easier to be the minority party, the minority leader, because when things go wrong, you can just hold up your hands and say, what are you going to do? We didn't have the power to stop it. It's their fault. And you just keep watching your stock portfolio grow. Everything's peachy. So with the knowledge that the GOP are probably just going to spend the next 4 to 8 years being little bitches who get very few votes, we have to focus upon what the DNC is going to do. The ball is firmly in their court. I think there are roughly 2 paths that the Biden-Harris ticket can go down once they actually get in office. Door number 1 is actually a potential solution to a lot of this unrest, both from lower-class whites and from lower-class blacks for different reasons. And door number 2 is absolute catastrophe, albeit it's a little bit of a winding road. So let me explore both of them. With the first one, I think the absolute key here is you have a whole bunch of very unhappy people right now. The white Americans are unhappy because they think they're not getting what they deserve, and they're worried about losing their jobs and not being able to find something else. Well, universal basic income would solve that. It would give everyone the little bit of breathing room that they need in order to not get this panicked, resentful mixture that seems to lead to mimetic violence every time. Now, I personally am not thrilled at the prospect of UBI because I think it guarantees bureaucratic dependency forevermore. However, since we've already visited the fact that there is no political will to get rid of the central banking system, at the end of the day, I think I have to face the facts and realize that if we're going to print the dollar to worthlessness, well, it's probably better to send some of those dollars to the people who are just going to spend it right back into the economy and keep things running at least a little bit smoothly, versus just spending it all on whatever evil shit DC thinks up at any given day. And the UBI is also a call that might help to alleviate some of this racial tension, although, again, I think mostly that's being intentionally evoked to play both sides and pit people against each other, because we can all roughly agree on the fact that the rent is too damn high, and it'd sure be nice to be able to take a few risks instead of always doing the economically safe thing and living in fear of losing one's employment. The other big step they could take is drug legalization, at least of marijuana. This is not rocket science, guys. You know what? Ban alcohol and legalize weed. Like that'd be the 200 IQ solution. But really, legalize it, tax it like cigarettes, put a warning on it if you want, and use the tax revenue to pay for health care. It's such a simple solution, and no one has ever gone home and beat their kids after smoking a doobie. P.S. Make sure to slip in there for the diehard conservatives that this is a move to cut the knees out from under the drug cartels. They'll love that, even if they don't love the idea of living next to Grateful Dead fans. If the DNC can get those two things up and running successfully, I think that'll give them a lot of good grace and wiggle room to do what they want with health care, and maybe even do what they want with immigration. Although, again, the absolute best thing they can do is to just perfect legal immigration. But they probably won't, because, pandering to those who find any legalization, naturalization process too difficult is a good way to generate some new votes with every passing cycle. If Biden roughly does those things, he has an opportunity to be the most well-loved and well-remembered president in modern times. Now, door number 2. No UBI. Maybe because the Republicans stop them, I don't know. Obviously, for the sake of keeping that stock portfolio going up, continue the aggressive outsourcing, automation, encouraging of illegal immigration, etc., to the point that we see that, truck driver sum of all fears, where all of them one day get told, hey, the automated 18-wheelers are here, go home, we don't need you, learn to code, I guess. If that happens, I personally will consider that news headline to be scarier than if I read something about, say, the San Andreas Fault or Yellowstone or an asteroid. Because then we're going to find out what happens when people who are accustomed to a certain lifestyle, and we're talking about the humble lifestyle relatively of truck drivers, but when people who expect one thing are told, well, you don't get that ever again, that is taking away the toy from one of the most spoiled children the U.S. populace of all history. And the tantrum that will ensue is going to be unholy on many levels. They could also perhaps decriminalize some drugs, but still fail to actually legalize, thus failing to generate any tax revenue. That one's not quite as bad as the others because, again, in a central banking system, the idea of taxation doesn't even make sense. Just print however much you need. So the IRS is completely pointless. The only reason why we still have it is to pay those government employees instead of laying them off because, yeah, government employees will be the last to go in this mass layoff from automation and whatnot. And, not to mention the DEA, of course. If they also really continue to pile on with the blatant illegal immigration, and let's be honest, particularly from those Islamic countries that are most hostile to the native U.S. culture, you are going to have created the perfect powder keg between the majority population of the U.S. and everyone else, be it minority ethnic groups or politicians and media in general. It will be Weimar 2.0 quite literally. What then could take said Weimar 2.0 into a 1940s scenario? Well, it'd be the final thing that the DNC and our journalist complex could accomplish, which is to continue all the woke shit and make it clear to that majority, mostly white, somewhat right-of-center Americans that everything they hold to be true and dear is incorrect, unacceptable, triggering, deplorable, whatever word for wrong think you want to insert there. Because simultaneously the deplatforming will have been completed. So what you will have effectively done is you will have stripped a heavily armed majority population of all of its political power, all of its hope or expectations in the future, all of its sense of any homogenistic values of any kind, all of its belief in the legitimacy of the political system that governs it and is viewed as dictating to it. The neuromancer / cyberpunk hellscape of plebeians living amidst high tech will have been reined in, and these people will have no outlet whatsoever to vent their frustrations because they will all have been driven underground in a communication sense. If you accomplish all of that, you need just a slight degree of economic desperation, like, say, hyperinflation making a gallon of milk cost $20-$30, and you will see the right-wing extremism or fascism that the left has been claiming Donald Trump represents. And you won't see it on Twitter. You'll see it in the streets. It's not too late to prevent that eventuality, but boy, it feels like that might be the most likely outcome right now, and that scares the bejesus out of me. I debated telling this because to a lot of people who don't believe there's anything to dreams, it might just sound like the signs of a troubled psyche, but I've decided to not wuss out and go ahead and relay it. I had a dream when I was about 10 years old that certainly I thought at the time must be just a nightmare. And now I'm not so sure. What the dream was is I was either walking or maybe driving past a beachfront, and it seemed to be the Atlantic off the east coast of the U.S. And I saw people standing on the beach who were all dressed similarly, and people kneeling on the beach who were not all dressed similarly. The one thing that the people who were kneeling had in common was they were mostly racial minorities, although I'm pretty sure that there were some white people kneeling as well. And what I saw next was that one of the black people who had been kneeling was sort of picked up by the arms and thrown into the water, and those that were standing in uniform were screaming at this person something akin to simply "go back to Africa if you don't like it here." Now, that's probably an expression that I was familiar with by that age, so that's not entirely shocking, but like with most dreams, it's not what can be recorded on paper that stood out, but how real it felt that prompted me to share it, because for the first time, I really do think that it's possible that that's, well, prophecy. One thing I've said for quite a while now is I do believe that the American left wing is the greatest threat to the country right now that we've ever had before. But I believe it because, and this is the important caveat, because they are capable of bringing a radical right wing to this country. There is something about this country, our melting pot type culture, the fact that we'll take people from everywhere so long as they help us get where we're going. We're inherently moderate in some respect, at least we used to be. And boy, if we aren't trying to lose that right now. For today's episode, because I've been slacking a little bit on this podcast, I thought that I might throw in a little extra, which is a small blog article that I wrote on the topic of mandatory vaccination recently, because I do believe that the great stress, economic and otherwise, caused by coronavirus is at least partially responsible for everything we've already discussed. So, here it goes. Mandatory vaccination by yours truly, written August 8th, 2020. USA Today has finally let the other shoe drop, and I'd like to commend the authors, 3 professors of medicine, law, and bioethics, on being frank. It's refreshing. Quote, "Defeat COVID-19 by requiring vaccination for all. It's not un-American, it's patriotic. Make vaccines free, don't allow religious or personal objections, and punish those who won't be vaccinated. They are threatening the lives of others." End quote. Unlike most opinion pieces today, riddled with intentional and unintentional vagueness, this one leaves me with only one question. What punishment do you have in mind? They list a few ideas, but none that would totally contain potential spreading. Because these professors take the example of conscientious objectors versus draft dodgers, I suppose that is where one must start. So we're probably talking about massive fines, $250,000, or imprisonment. Actually, considering most Americans do not nor ever will have that kind of cash on hand, especially since we've just nuked our economy due to this very same fear of death, imprisonment is probably the only feasible option. So, to the professor of bioethics in particular, I would like to further narrow down the question. How is it ethical to imprison unvaccinated persons together during a pandemic? The subtext of this, of course, being that this all but guarantees they will contract COVID-19, whereas they would have otherwise been playing the odds like every other animal during every other outbreak of anything ever? Or is the plan a house arrest? And if so, how would it be enforced? We are, after all, in the midst of supposedly abolishing the police. Are the brown shirt volunteers already organized to guard these house arrests? And how are we going to denote the homes of the deplorables? A spray-painted Star of David across the doorposts, perhaps? But one doubts the logistics and or bravery required to enforce house arrest. So we're back to that insane, crazy, no good, #canceled Alex Jones's territory with his FEMA camps will be converted into concentration camps scenario. Boy, oh boy, is anyone else just waiting for the 2020 alien invasion at this point? Just to clarify, assuming any such concentration or imprisonment isn't a death camp outright, a rather generous concession at this point in the nation's political discourse, all of the filthy unvaccinated will catch COVID-19. So the implied policy is this: if you will not let the government save you, it will do its very best to kill you instead. I must admit, when I wrote about the American church being wholly unprepared for persecution, and the possibility of the long-awaited mark of the beast doubling as some vaccine passport business license portmanteau last week, I wasn't expecting such a sudden manifestation. But such is the world of the singularity, I suppose, a new reality with each morning's dawn. So let's get big picture again, and this time we'll deal with being an American in addition to being a Christian. When the Antichrist comes, he brings peace, albeit one eventually revealed to be false or temporary. So right off the bat, we know that anyone who does not take his mark is going to fall prey to a Patriot Act and NDAA reasoning. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Worded slightly differently, this simply means go with the flow or get dashed against the rocks. It's a kind of national security gaslighting, wherein the citizens must convince their government that they are not a threat, guilty until proven innocent, rather than the other way around. In philosophical terms, this takes Hobbes' Leviathan, the state as mutual protector, whom loses the right to fealty in proportion to the external harm it fails to protect its citizens from, or causes to them internally, and inverts it. The individuals whom were to be protected by this fealty must now protect the state's interests with a self-sacrificial fealty that defeats the state's very purpose. I would term this inversion state for its own sake. Somewhere in here lies the all-too-real consequences of differing ideologies that our often impotent partisan bickering has obscured over the last few decades. A significant portion of this country is and has been all but begging for a left-wing, quasi-Marxist state for its own sake, wherein they are perfectly content to throw out the Constitution, the Mutual Protection Compact, so long as doing so accomplishes the unironic utopia that they have in mind. One need only listen to them for a few minutes to gather a few things. One, they are solipsists. Other people are not genuinely real to them. They simply react with others on a you make me feel good, you make me feel bad basis. And two, this solipsistic lack of imagination renders them incapable of understanding the complexities of a society that is inherently comprised of self-interested individuals. In other words, it is easy for them to flippantly say, just give everyone free food, because they can imagine themselves being gifted a lifetime supply of free food. But what they cannot possibly imagine is the incredible, indeed currently impossible, collaboration between individuals that would be necessary to achieve such a Star Trekian feat. Another way of summarizing them would be to say, they know what feels good, therefore they believe they know what is good as a matter of course. Contrast this, if you would, with the classical view I attempted to sketch in the aforementioned Christianity piece, which I will link below. This is certainly the less feel-good of the two worldviews, for it can be summarized as the acknowledgement and acceptance of inherent pain or difficulty, an economics of scarcity, and indeed the determination of value via scarcity, be it scarcity of resources, time, i.e. the realization that all flesh must die, or even talent. Men are obviously not equal to one another in a literal sense. And a belief in transcendence, something greater than wretched mortal mankind, derived not just from religious dogma, but from man's very desire for something more, in contrast to all other animals that are truly adapted to this environment and thus do not experience discontent with it. Christianity is firmly planted upon or rooted within this classical view. It differs from the pagan classics only in that it, 1, depicts transcendence coming down to man, instead of man, largely in vain, aspiring upwards to it, and 2, in doing so, it offers a vicarious solution, wherein transcendence gifts itself to us precisely because of our inability to perfectly grasp it ourselves. Consequently, the political difference between these two views can be summed up in one word: trust. The Constitution, while not inherently Christian, at every opportunity elects the classical view. Men are fallible and corruptible, entropy and degradation are the rule rather than the exception, and in spite of or even because of this, transcendence may flourish when cultivated and guarded. This abject lack of trust in human nature is not self-flagellation, but vigilance. If we are going to lay our hands upon the good and true, we must remain ever aware of the fact that we are not naturally good or truthful. This transcendent cynicism is particularly evident in Benjamin Franklin, whom to the question of what sort of government the United States would be, famously responded, "A republic, if you can keep it." He was the oldest of the Founding Fathers. Indeed, compared to the others, he was more a founding grandfather. He had seen more politicking as ambassador to France than many of the others put together had or ever would see. Remember, quite a few of them retired from their posts back to their farms, as opposed to the current lifelong bureaucrats we've become accustomed to. In this, he was as internally balanced as his external Renaissance man accomplishments suggest. He was undoubtedly a hangable liberal in his time, but he never forgot a curmudgeonly distrust for the nature of man that a classical education bequeaths. Some of the constitutional whippersnappers were undoubtedly less cynical, the currently celebrated Hamilton being one, but nonetheless they all followed his and Jefferson's advice about checks and balances, separation of powers, etc. The consequence of their political distrust is this most prosperous of all nations. Yet, like all comfortable individuals or groups, our vigilance has waned. We've grown doughy and dull and drank a bit too much of our own Kool-Aid about acceptance and diversity and being nice at any cost. Those who have studied the fall of Rome cannot help but see comparables. It almost appears that decadent societies willfully commit collective suicide, be it out of despair or to let new mutations flourish. Personally, I cannot help but see this USA Today opinion piece as another such example, wherein 3 men whom have ostensibly flourished at the teat of American classical values, and 2 of whom have likely taken the classical Hippocratic oath to do no harm, call for those very values to be trampled in favor of the state for its own sake. Let me clarify that last sentence, as I fear it's easy to miss why I so confidently assert that these professors are of the state for its own sake. It isn't just because they are chucking the Constitution in favor of what's currently in vogue among coastal elites. It's because they trust the motivations of their state and themselves in this matter wholeheartedly. In other words, these men, whom are, at least in their careers, clearly capable of parsing great complexities, have here treated of an incredibly complex issue, perhaps the most complex we've faced since the Civil Rights Movement, in roughly 10 pithy and self-assured paragraphs. They write as though they are the God they almost certainly do not believe in. The tone of their confidence is so perfect that it at first reads as though they are totally devoid of ego, a trick of masterful rhetoric not unlike Lucifer's dialogue in the Book of Job. One would think that such intelligent men would approach this grim subject with a certain trepidation, perhaps even fear and trembling. But no, they have the solution, and they're here to bequeath it to the otherwise helpless plebs. This is the best evidence of their anti-classical state-for-its-own-sake persuasion. The same may be seen from Marx all the way down to Alinsky. Prose without compromise, concession, quandary, or, to an eerie degree, curiosity. They do not set their pen to paper until their minds are wholly made up. For them, writing is not an exploration, but a declamation. A single word for this might simply be propaganda. All sides of political arguments utilize propaganda as the dictionary defines it, but as you are currently witnessing, the classical persuasion is far more likely to make concession and generally not act as though it is God's gift to the world. This clinical form of persuasion puts me in mind of T.S. Eliot's quip about the world ending with a whimper rather than a bang. It strikes me that if some Antichrist figure really were to arise in the present moment, it would most likely not be Nostradamus's great squawker Hitler. That style is too militant and demanding to seduce our obese and anemic collective. No, if he were to come today, his would be a voice that states with sultry bedside manner, "Please remain calm. There's nothing you can do. Just leave it to the professionals." Certainly, that is what is being asked in the USA Today piece. Stop resisting, just do it, be reasonable, we're only doing our jobs. A standard fare speech by the guards of every gulag ever. To tie a bow on all this mess, I don't know if the COVID-19 vaccine will actually be mandatory. I don't know if it will be based on Pasteur's theory of antibiotics or the gene editing of the mRNA approach. I don't know if it will be a one and done or endless boosters as antibodies fade and mutations form. I don't know if there is anything truly special about COVID-19 or if we'll start mandating similar vaccine regimens for anything and everything that could potentially send human beings where they're going, the grave, a little earlier than expected. I don't know if the labs developing these vaccines are ethical and moral, profit-driven, or a mixture of both. I don't know if these vaccines are actually safe, or if we're going to be guinea pigs for side effects that won't be fully understood for years to come. I don't know if taking such a vaccine is significantly less dangerous than just taking my chances with COVID-19. I don't know but that I might feel the same way even if this virus were considerably more fatal. And I don't know if this would be the mark of the beast or just a dress rehearsal, conditioning a population to the general idea. But here's what I do know. I don't trust strangers or human nature in general. The only entity I trust unquestionably is the Lord God Almighty. I'm definitely going to die, one way or another, now or later. Some values are more important than prolonging a life destined to end anyway. Between being patriotic with a pulse or dead with a deity, I'll take the latter, considering life is a single page bookended by eternities. And last of all, quote, "A man chooses, a slave obeys," end quote. Andrew Ryan, BioShock.